Perhaps you remember that little anecdote about Mullah Nasruddin when he's on pilgrimage, as he oftentimes did, and met a priest on the road. And in their conversation, the priest, who was full of pride in himself, said to the mullah, "I'm so selfless that I only think of others, I never think of myself." And the mullah answered, "Oh yes, I'm also selfless, but in my selflessness I am everyone else, so I can afford to think of myself." And over these last days, in sharing anecdotes with my sisters, one of them asked me where the stories started. And instead of relating the story about how it was with Divine Mother, I related to her that little anecdote about how the time when we were in Jerusalem at the kibbutz and walking back to our accommodation one night, a young man who was escorting us asked me, "What is the secret of your stories?" And I just turned to him and I said, "I am the stories." And then I added to my sisters, "Everyone is a story. Everyone is a story. And when we're with someone, even if they're only sharing a part of their story, the whole is contained in that part. So in being totally absorbed and one with their story, there's no place for empathy, pity, compassion. In other words, there is no separateness." And my sister understood exactly what was being said here, and no doubt you will understand it also. But it reminded me of that story about the Tibetan master called Dongma, and he was quite a strange fellow. You could say he was somewhat of a Taoist, because instead of being the abbot of a monastery, he lived in a small cave up in the mountains, and he refused no one. Everyone was welcome. He never said no. He used to say that people would come and learn what they learned, and when they learned what they needed to learn, they would move on. And the reason why he lived in a small cave in the mountains of Tibet was because in living high up there and looking out at the majesty of those mountains, he lived with his insignificance. But there was a story about the time when he was returning to his cave, and his cave was located in a place by which he had to go through a mountain pass. And it was known that in this mountain pass that there were brigands and robbers who would prey on the travelers who had to take that route to go from one village to another. So one day when Dongma was on the road, he was accosted by 4 of these robbers, and they could see that he had nothing to steal. So they were discussing amongst themselves what they would do with him. Perhaps they could kill him. But anyway, one of the robbers said to Dongma, we know who you are." And Dongma quietly said to them, "Well, you'll know where to find me, won't you?" And so after their discussions, they let him go on his way, and he returned to his small mountain cave. But some weeks later, as he was sitting outside the cave, sipping his butter tea, a man came up the path, and Dongma immediately recognized him as being one of the robbers who had accosted him on the road. And when the man approached him, he was rather cocky, and he said, "Well, I've come to learn from you." And Dongma said, "I can teach you nothing. Go and learn respect." And the robber was rather taken aback, because he'd heard that Dongma didn't refuse anybody, didn't turn anyone away. So he said, "What do you mean respect? Respect for what?" Dongma said, "Respect for all of life." "But," said the robber, "I heard that you didn't refuse anyone." And Dongma just shook his head and said, Go and learn respect." Well, the robber was taken aback, but what could he do? He went to turn around and go back down the path again, when all of a sudden Dongma said, Wait, just a minute." And the robber, hopeful, turned back, thinking that he was going to be called back and taught something, and instead Dongma gave him a few crusts of bread, which the robber immediately took and stomped on it. And Dongma said, "What are you doing?" And the robber said, I'm stomping on this. I steal what I want." And Dongma said, "Why are you stealing on so many people?" "What do you mean?" said the robber. "Well," said Dongma, "that bread was made by a baker, and the baker had to have someone who ground the grain, and the grain had to be planted by someone, and the seeds taken and thrashed and made into the flour that made the wheat." And the robber said, "I'll remember that next time I steal some." And he stomped off down the path. But some weeks later, the robber came back up the path again. And before the robber went off, Dongma said, "Oh, and by the way, if you happen to come back, bring something that you stole with you." So those few weeks later, when the robber came back into the presence of Dongma said, well, what is it you've stolen? Where is it that... And the robber said, "Well, I haven't got anything that I've stolen." Dongma said, well, why? And the robber said, "Well, I didn't think of it." He said, "Well, when I was there and I started to talk to people, and they started to tell me their stories, I realized that everybody had worked hard for what they had, and afterwards I couldn't steal anything from them." Dongma said, "Well, how did you live then?" And the robber said, "Well, when I started to listen to people, and I recognized what was in their stories, they, even unbidden, they started to give me things. So I found that I was given food, and besides hearing their stories, they gave me food and things to eat. So I have nothing to bring them to you." And so Dongma said, "Well," and just at that moment, a young boy came over to serve them butter tea. And when the robber looked up, he looked, and he had a moment of recognition on his face when the boy started, and the boy immediately, obviously, recognized him. And Dongma said, Oh yes, this young boy came to me just a little while ago. He'd been kicked out of his house after being beaten by his father and told that he was nothing. And a traveler came along, and when the young boy told his story that he felt just like a crumb, the traveler had told him that the crumb was part of the whole, and told him the story. And so the young boy has made his way here." So they served the buttered tea, and then of course the robber had to go off, and Dongma said, yes, now go and learn how to listen. And the robber said, but I want to learn meditation. Go, and said Dongma. And so reluctantly the robber went off again. But several months later he came back up the path, and he said to Dongma, well, I've done what you told me to do. I've learned to listen, but now I want to help people, so I want to learn from you. And Dongma said, I can teach you nothing, but your first student is doing very well. What do you mean? Said the robber. But Dongma pointed to the young boy again, who was again serving the butter tea. And the robber said, well, in listening, I began to realize that I didn't remember myself anymore. Well, how did you eat, and what happened in your life that you look quite healthy to me? And the robber recounted how it was when he began to listen intently. He forgot who he was. And so the robber said, well, now I'm ready to learn meditation. And Dongma said, I can teach you nothing. Anyway, I'm leaving this place. I'm going to my summer retreat. But you know, if you want to, you can come and visit me there. So there was hope in the robber's heart that finally he would learn meditation, so that now in his heart he could fulfill that thought that he could help people. But then before he left, Dongma said to him, but when you come, bring me some nettles. But remember, you must not be stung by those nettles. So the robber went off scratching his head, but determined that he would fulfill what the master Dongma had told him. So after several weeks, the robber went around, and he had to find a way to take these nettles without being stung. So he took off the remainder of his clothing, and he wrapped his hands in the nettles, and he carried them to a path that would lead him to where the master Dongma was. And on his way, all he could think about was the nettles. But then, before arriving at the place where Dongma was, he had to cross a rope bridge. And when he came to the bridge was swaying back and forth. But all he could think of was the nettles, carefully carrying them, even when he was on the rope bridge that swung from side to side, and the roaring torrent that lay below roared around him. All he could think of was his task of taking these nettles without being stung. When he crossed the rope bridge, he could see the master Dongma again sitting outside the little hut that was there, sipping his buttered tea. And as he was approaching, Dongma shouted, well, how was the journey? But the robber did not speak a word, concentrating entirely on bringing the nettles to the master without being stung. When he arrived at the master and even put the nettles down in front of him, he was still thinking of nettles, and the master just looked at him and smiled and nodded. What's the significance of this story for us? Recognizing the way stations that we've had, recognizing that all of us, to arrive where we are, have had to lose our self, to learn to listen, to become so absorbed in the listening that there was no trace of self. But we can recognize that in every listening there is a story, somebody's story. Whether that is a being that's in front of us, whether it's a spirit that's floating around lost in the ethers, whether it's an angel that's come along to impart something to us, or an energy, a master that comes along like the whiff of a breeze, and we're listening, and there's no self. But what's left? What do these nettles represent for us? Where are we now? The listening, life, the stories, the endless stories, and yet now there's something that represents these nettles. Where is it we rest while the stories move in and out and around? Where do we rest? What is this place? The stories, endless stories, allowing us to remain in a place of selflessness, because with each story there's the listening, the absorption, and yet the nettles. What do they represent for us? Where are we now?